Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. The topics discussed in this podcast will reflect my opinions and are not in any way to be regarded as medical advice. The world is round and the earth revolves around the sun. Pretty bland statements of the obvious today. Go back about 500 years to the early part of the 16th century, so the early 1500s, and Galileo Galilei was put in jail for proposing that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around, and general consensus was that the earth was flat. As time goes by, what we believe to be true may not in fact be true. New information comes to light. Now, regular listeners to this podcast and those of you who might have followed my blog over the years will know that I am by nature a bit of a contrarian. Everybody says that a particular event occurs or something must be this way. My personal inclination is to question that. The more there is groupthink, and I can't remember who said it, but when everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks very much. So we always have to be questioning of conventional wisdom. And if it can stand up to questioning, great. That's what we want. It's confirmed. One of the problems in medical science is that a lot of studies aren't verified. And John P. Ioannidis of Stanford has been a big one on this, that a lot of medical studies make a finding, but they're never verified. And if they're not verified, how can we actually be confident that they are the case? So really interesting study done by, of all people, and this is actually a bit of a surprise, the American Cancer Society looking at the impact of secondhand smoke. Now, let's be very clear at the outset. Smoking is the number one preventable risk factor for cancer. And in fact, this study says that cigarette smoking is by far the leading risk factor, accounting for 20% of all cancers and 30% of cancer deaths. That's pretty big. And again, you'd think, and this is a little bit about diversion, but we'll go there for a moment before coming back, that governments would be making it as easy as possible for people to give up smoking, given that. And this is before we're talking about heart attack and stroke, peripheral vascular disease, and a host of other conditions where smoking is a risk factor. But, for those of you who are interested, go back to previous podcasts where we talk about vaping and the appalling attitude of the Australian government making it harder for people to quit smoking. But going back to this study, what they also found was that the risk of passive smoking was negligible. And I'll quote from this article, and we'll put it in the description below. The population attributable fraction, PAF, that is the share of cancer deaths that could be prevented if a given risk factor was removed, is 28.5% for cigarette smoking and 0.7% for secondhand smoke, a 41-fold difference. Although the PAF for second-hand smoke is statistically significant, the magnitude of the risk is negligible and similar to the risk estimate in our BMJ paper. Now, our BMJ paper is the authors of this article. A relative risk of 1.0 denotes no increased risk. In our study, the lung cancer risk for never smokers married to ever smokers, so somebody who's never smoked compared to somebody who smokes all the time or is a continuous smoker, compared to the risk for never smokers married to never smokers was 0.75, so again, less than 1.0, and the difference was not statistically significant, indicating no elevated risk from environmental tobacco smoke. Anybody who smokes should be aiming to give it up. We know that. And I remember the days, some of you might, in the 80s and 90s when the idea of smoke-free zones was starting to come in. And I remember being on a plane, and in those days they had smoking and non-smoking sections, and it was a nonsense. I remember sitting in an aisle, sitting in a line behind the smoking section. So we were the first row. That's it. That's the word, row. First row in the non-smoking section. The row in front was the smoking section. There's no glass barrier. There's nothing to stop the air drifting across. And by the way, a plane isn't airtight. So surprise, surprise, even though we're in the non-smoking section, you got some cigarette smoke. It's unpleasant. I don't like tobacco smoke. Most people, and typically those who don't smoke and often ex-smokers, do not like tobacco smoke. It's not pleasant, but it's not deadly. And I was first alerted to this in a brilliant book published in the late 2000s called Scared to Death. I don't know if it's still in print or not. And it went through a number of health scares. And every one of them, it was written by UK authors and mainly touched on issues in the UK, not exclusively. But every one of the health scares turned out to be a non-event. But some of the actions taken, particularly by government, to try and deal with it were massive. And the harms suffered by people was significant. Cast your mind back to the beginning of this decade and something similar happened probably for the first time on a massive global scale. So smoke-free zones are a good idea. I do not particularly want to be exposed to passive smoke. If somebody wants to smoke, I will advise them not to if they ask my opinion. If they don't ask my opinion, then it's not for me to ram it down their throats. However, if that passive smoke enters my breathing space and I'm exposed to it, then they're not keeping it to themselves. But there's a very big difference between saying, I don't like it, it's not pleasant, and I shouldn't have to be exposed to it. Do your own thing, but don't include me in it, versus this is somehow a danger to me. And worse than that, it's scared a lot of people who then get paranoid about, I've inhaled a little bit of environmental smoke, am I going to die from it? Well, these studies, and there was one done in 2003 that showed the same findings as this one, is that you're not. Now, there's a degree of dose relationship, but when they study people who have never smoked, married to people who are lifetime smokers, and you compare them to people who are non-smokers married to non-smokers, and there's no difference or no major difference or no statistically significant difference, it's probably telling you it's not that dangerous. It's not a good idea, but it's not dangerous, and I really want to differentiate the two. The book Scared to Death quoted a paper, a study was actually being done by the World Health Organization, started in 1958, a long time ago, and went for many years and was to be published in the early 2000s, but the publication of it was suppressed, and this was a study on the effects of passive smoking or environmental tobacco smoke exposure that showed pretty much what these two studies, the 03 and this one from 2023, showed, and there's been another one done by the authors again, that it's not pleasant, but it's not dangerous. So what's the solution to all of this? We want smoke-free areas. If I'm sitting at a restaurant, no, I don't want tobacco smoke in the room, and nobody who's not a smoker wants it either, and that is absolutely fair enough. People choose to smoke in their own homes, in their own time, in their own way. As I said before, I would strongly advise them, I think any doctor would, most people would, to not do it for all the obvious reasons. Everybody's familiar with that. But if they choose to do it, it is their business. But a little bit like loud noise, there's a point at which if you've got the music on in your home, there's a volume at which it stays within your home, there's a volume at which it starts to irritate and annoy the neighbours. And it's at that point that you need to turn the volume down. So this is the same situation. There's a point at which it starts to impact and interfere with the life and enjoyment and positions of other people who are just sitting around near where you are. So again, planes, public transport, restaurants, the list is a fairly long one. Yeah, keep it to yourself, and you can't do that inside, so you need to go outside. Completely fair enough. But we don't need to be scared. But more importantly, and Vinay Prasad again has put out on his Substack the issue of trust in public health, the danger, it's like the boy who cried wolf or the story of Chicken Little. The more of these horror and danger stories that get put out and subsequently get proved to be wrong, the worse it is for the reputation of public health. And trust in public health is at an all-time low, and to be honest, I completely understand that. And no amount of complaining about dis or misinformation takes away from the fact that it's all their own work. So it's very simple. Be honest with people, and part of being honest with people says either we don't know, or this is what we believe at the moment, or we don't want people to have to endure secondhand smoke. It's not a good idea without saying that it's going to be a major risk factor, because all of this work says it's not pleasant, it is not a major risk factor. So let's keep to the facts, let's not get into hyperbole, and obviously let's make it as easy as possible for people to quit smoking. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and consider subscribing. Tell your friends. If there are topics you'd like to see covered, be in touch through the chat or email info@drjoe.net.au. We'll be uploading new content each Monday, and soon we'll be putting these videos out on X. You can follow me there at Dr. Joe's DIY Health.